Good evening to our audience in Bangladesh, good morning in the USA, and good afternoon in Europe. Welcome to our third conversation on historic preservation. As you may have seen, we have organized two conversations already. The first one was on the nature of public participation in historic preservation, followed by our conversation on the crucial intersection between historic preservation and development. Today, we are going to talk about the state of historic preservation in South Asia. South Asia, as you all know, is in the throes of an intense urban development phase that appears determined to reshape the region's major urban centers. You might call it a form of new urban renewal. Like its predecessors in the West, this campaign of renewal looks at the past either with an ambivalence that is tantamount to negligence or with a hostility that sees history as an abstraction on the path to a shining future. In Indian and Bangladeshi cities, this shining future is one filled with tall, swanky modern buildings, in whose path stands a collective body of mid-century modernist buildings. Considered out of date and incompatible with the prevailing smart urbanist mood, their removal is easily rationalized. This aggressive demolish and development urban vision dominates the thinking of political leaders and administrators, while the historical value of modernist architecture is lost on the public, which alone seems capable of defending it. As you all know, modernism was integral to the project of post-colonial, quote and unquote, identity building in South Asia. Today, these post-partition buildings are stranded in a no man's land, not sufficiently old enough to merit the label of heritage and thereby deprived of protection through any legal instruments. The situation is further complicated by the lack of constitutionally autonomous heritage regulatory bodies with sufficient legal authority to protect historically significant buildings. It is in this context we will be discussing the state of historic preservation in South Asia. We are very pleased that we have four very important voices from very different parts of the world today. First up is Kathryn Dunham, who's an urban designer and adjunct professor at Columbia University. But her another identity is that she is the daughter of Daniel Dunham, one of the designers of the Kamalapur railway station in Dhaka, which, by the way, faces the risk of demolition. And one of the reasons why we were inspired to organize these webinars. So Kamalapur railway station faces the risk of the wrecking ball, along with teachers student center at the Dhaka University. Kate spent a significant portion of her childhood in Dhaka, in what was then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. So I'm sure that she is going to bring us some very good insights, particularly as it relates to her father's experience in Bangladesh, who designed many buildings in not only in Dhaka, but in other parts of Bangladesh, for example, in Rajshahi. Next up is Niklaus Graber, who's an architect, who's a practicing architect and a curator of architectural exhibitions in Switzerland. He curated the much acclaimed exhibition, Bengal Stream, a few years ago, and I just learned from him that Bengal Stream exhibition will soon arrive in Bangladesh later this year. and I'm sure he will be talking about it. The exhibition that Niklaus curated, Bengal Stream, traveled across Europe, and I'm happy to say that it shed much light on the architectural modernism in Bangladesh. Next is Jigna Desai, who's an associate professor in the Faculty of Architecture at the CEPT University in Ahmedabad, India. And she's also executive director of the Center for Heritage Conservation. And she's a foremost authority on the subject of historic preservation in India, and we look forward to receiving her insights today. And finally, we have Wahida Rashid, who's also known as Tonu. She is a senior environmental planner with the California Department of Transportation, and also affiliated with, she's also affiliated with the Bangladesh Environmental Network, BEN. She has vast experience in historic preservation as it relates to environmental planning and environmental impact assessment. So welcome to all of you. Our conversation will go on for about an hour, followed by a Q&A session. So I would like to request all our attendees to write your question in the Q&A section of Zoom or on Facebook page, where we are also live streaming this conversation. So without further ado, let's begin. So my first question is to Kate. Kate, you experienced time in Dhaka. You spent time in Dhaka. You spent your childhood in Dhaka. You have seen through your kiddie eyes the work of your father, and I'm sure you have traveled. Share your thoughts on your experience and particularly your father's experience of designing Kamalapur railway station, and perhaps you can talk about the Kamalapur railway station and its significance in the kind of the modernism in Bangladesh. So, Kate.
Thank you, Adnan, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I always like to talk with a picture on the screen, so if it's okay, can I do share screen?
I think so. Shafayat, can
I got it, I think.
Okay, you got it? Okay, very good.
Is that working?
Yes.
So yeah, I think perhaps what I can do is give sort of the human story behind one foreign architect in Dhaka in the 1960s. My father came to Dhaka to work with Berger engineers, which at that time had a lot of work in East Pakistan, designing new roadways, bridges, rail lines, but they were also getting a lot of architecture projects. And at that time, there was no architect in the country. Mazrul Islam, I think, was studying abroad. So my father was brought on to start the architectural services and immediately had an enormous amount of work to do, including master plans for Mymensingh and Rajshahi and university buildings and office buildings. And among those projects in his first year and a half was the Kamalapur railway station. And in those first 2 years, from 1960 to 62, before I was born, he fell in love with Bangladesh and learning about the culture and the architectural heritage of Bangladesh. On this slide, I'm just giving an overview of the various things he did, from being an architect at Berger. After 2 years, he switched over to help start the architecture program from which you graduated, Adnan. He was among the founding faculty to start the architecture program and thought a lot with the team of architects about what should the architectural curriculum be in Bangladesh and how to incorporate the history of Bengal's architecture into the curriculum. And then on the side, he was doing all sorts of consulting projects and inventing solar cookers and doing cyclone relief. So that's just to give you an overview of over an 8-year period, how invested my father was in working in Bangladesh. But I wanted to step back to say how much he was fascinated by the architectural history in the Bengal region. And my parents would go for weekend-long trips to what they would call the forgotten ruins and just document sort of the history of buildings that were no longer appreciated. And my father brought this into the teaching and into the curriculum at BUET, and would talk about things such as this building on the upper left. I don't know where it is, but how unique the shape of the arch was in this building to the Bengal region, that this was something unique to Bangladesh and was part of a movement of architectural styles across from India into Bengal. And I bring that up because it clearly influenced him in his own work, such as in Kamlapur railway station. And I guess the last thing I'd want to emphasize with my father's work was that he was combining his own education, which was in the modernist architectural style. He came from Gropius and Sert, and he was learning about the latest technology in concrete, very thin concrete shell vaults. And so he brought that knowledge with him. But then in his time in Bangladesh, he learned so much about the local culture, the local materials, the heritage of architecture, and brought that all into his design, along with his environmental responsiveness to the local climate. And his buildings all took into account monsoon seasons, hot weather, and all of that feeds into specifically his design of Kamlapur Station, which in which he had an open building. He had no walls. And that was to make this building efficient, to work without air conditioning, to allow the breezes to come through, yet to protect everyone from the rains. And so I'll just, this will be the last slide, just to put that all together, that in the end, the station is a flexible design. It works as a railway station with the boxes for the ticketing, and admin can be moved around within these columns, but that means it's a building that can have other uses. It's an open plan. And I'm also showing on the side how this building is clearly loved by the local population of Dhaka. It's on the stamps, it's on the paintings of their rickshaws. And I think that's a result of all these things coming together that my father could bring in the design. So I'll end there. I don't want to take up too much more time.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Can you unshare?
Yeah, I'm doing that right now.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Kate. So let me go to Niklaus. Niklaus, you you have been to Bangladesh many times. I met you in Bangladesh, and I saw that you brought people from Switzerland. You went around in different parts of Bangladesh. So, and you curated this acclaimed and celebrated exhibition, Bengal Stream, and so which traveled across Europe in many parts, and it kind of shone some light on what is going on in Bangladesh in our own times. So I was wondering if you could share your experience of organizing Bengal Stream and what you learned from Bangladesh, and if you have any thoughts on the particularly mid-20th century buildings in Bangladesh. Niklaus.
Thank you, Adnan. And also, first of all, I would like to begin to thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I'm really pleased to be in that round, and I'm extremely happy that this group here of participants is consisting of members from across the world, because I think preservation and heritage legacy of modern architecture is not only an issue in South Asia, it is a global issue, and we are all having our struggles with that topic. So I would say we're maybe all in the same boat, whether you're in Bangladesh or we are in Europe or the US. And I think we constantly have to rethink what is the value of a building today. That's something I would like to come back a little bit later. And in that sense, for me, the greatest experience while organizing Bengal Stream and while being in Bangladesh and traveling and seeing modern buildings and contemporary buildings was to learn a lot about, let's say, timeless but sustainable architecture, which is, as Kate already mentioned, deeply rooted in the past on one hand, but on the other hand, it is also looking into the future in terms of sustainable use of materials, respecting climate. And at this stage of human history, we're talking about climate change, for example, which has become a crucial point while designing buildings. And when we're looking at Bangladesh, there's a lot to learn from the traditional buildings, but also how contemporary architects have transformed this history into absolutely up-to-date structures. And I think there may be different reasons. First of all, and there is a sensitivity, of course, for the homeland, for the history of the homeland, and the climate, the very specific climate of the tropics. And then also the history has brought many different influences. For thousands, hundreds of years, different cultures came across the Bengal Delta. Then colonialism came later, late modernism came. Some of the greatest architects at that time came to Bangladesh. Is it Louis Kahn? Is it Paul Rudolph? Is it Doxiadis? Is it Dunham, Bui, Rumen? All these guys came to the Bengal Delta. And I think this had a big impact on the education and also on the perception of young people, what good architecture could be. I think that blend of, let's say, international influence and local awareness, local heritage, that blend is somehow unique. I have hardly seen a nation or a country who has blended things in such an elaborated way that you can still feel the Bengali soul within the modern buildings. So it's somehow between a very global kind of awareness and a very local one. It's not a purely regionalistic thinking, and it's also not a purely international kind of global thinking. I think it's exactly that blend. And when we're looking to the late modern buildings, for example, Kanpur Station, we already discovered such a blend. As mentioned before, the tradition is there, maybe in a formal way, but it is also there in a climatic sense. On the other hand, the latest technology has brought into account. And that's something I was always fascinated with. And that made me travel many times back to Bangladesh and also bringing colleagues, architects from Europe to Bangladesh, because I think we can discover a lot of things we can learn from for our architecture here in the West as well. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to preservation, somehow we are not the ones knowing what to do here in the West, although we have a lot of old monuments. I think there is a very high awareness of preservation in Asia and in most of all in Bangladesh. If I think of the seminal exhibition by the Chetana Group, who has exhibited in 1997 all these drawings of old monuments, which somehow founded the base of contemporary architecture. Then I have to say I have never seen such a thing before. So when we're talking about heritage and what could be done in Bangladesh about it, I think there is a lot already done, and there is a very, very broad foundation to be built up. I think things are not too far away, and we just have to look around and look a little bit into the past, and we see that the awareness of, for monuments, for historical preservation is already here in a very elaborated sense, I would say. So coming back to the exhibition and the question of you, Adnan, I think today we are not in a stage where, for example, one region brings knowledge to another, like we heard it before in the 1960s. I think today it's for sure always both ways, and maybe it is even that we in the West we should look more carefully to the East and to see what is going on there. We have fantastic developments right now, climate sensitivity and so on, which we are slowly getting aware of. Anyway, this is maybe another chapter. But to conclude this this question, maybe I think we can always learn from both sides, and we're all in the same boat. So we should not be afraid of touching the subject of preservation. Nobody has a recipe. I cannot give you any advice, because we all have to to discuss it, and that's fantastic to have such a panel now where we can hear different opinions, and we can benefit from knowledge from all over the world.
Okay, so I'll come back to you about your experience in Switzerland and what's going on there, and talk about some examples if possible.
Right.
I'll come back to you. So let me go to Jigna. Jigna, I have met you in India. I have met you in Washington, DC. So I know you very well. You are, you think about historic preservation. And you teach about these issues on subjects of historic preservation. So I wanted to ask you, what has India's experience been in historic preservation, particularly since the demolition of the Hall of Nations in 2017? And paint a picture of historic preservation as it's evolving in India. And as you heard, Kate and Niklaus, that in Bangladesh it's an intense issue. But it's a very contentious issue. Some people say that no, this can be demolished because it's old. So what is old? How do we define old, or how do we define heritage? These are always contentious issues. So give us your take on the situation in India.
So I'll thank you, Adnan. I'll also start by thanking you for inviting me in this panel discussion. I think we have had a discussion about this where we've said that it's time that we start looking at the issue of historic preservation of South Asia together, rather than of different countries, for the very simple reason that the roots of historic preservation in South Asia lies in the Archaeological Survey of India, and I think all of us, all the countries here, kind of share those roots, where the initial efforts transcended by the Archaeological Survey of India, transcended these boundaries. So I think I see this as a great opportunity to kind of begin with that discussion. And the more I hear about what's going on in Bangladesh, the more I find that these parallels that we need to discuss, and we need to kind of arrive at certain kind of certain possible common narratives that are emerging through this. So I'll try. I think just like possibly in Bangladesh, painting the picture of historic preservation in India is not a simple task. It's extremely complex. It's kind of marred with various layers of narratives, of political narratives as well as economic narratives. But let me start with a positive note to begin with. I think in the past 2 decades, as a country, we have definitely seen more investment in historic preservation from the government and even from many private players. So it is seen, there is more, to put it very simply and crudely, there's more money going into historic preservation. There's more there are more funds allocated to it. Having said that, if you look at all the directions where the funds are going in, whether it is through the Archaeological Survey of India or whether it is through other government ministries like Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Urban Development, I think now it is Ministry of Urban Affairs, and Ministry of Tourism, one sees that the identification of what constitutes historic and what needs historic preservation is kind of are places or historic sites that are also linked with religious identities. So if you look at many government schemes or many archaeological sites that are being now surveyed, they are linked to certain religious cities that would have been identified. And I'm not saying that these cities belong to a particular religion. There has been care at times to identify religious cities that belong to different religions that are represented in the country. But there is this definitive narrative around religious identities. And then linking that to the question of tourism. So I think the awareness of heritage or the relationship or the relationship of historic preservation and the heritage of the country is more kind of more leaning towards the socio-political, religious, economic narratives of what, let me kind of once again to put my foot in my mouth, its utility for those purposes that it is being kind of recognized. I think what I see lacking is that historic preservation for the sake of understanding the historic identities or for the sake of understanding histories or for the sake of self-awareness or awareness of our past so that possibly we can move on rather than propagate it is something that is missing as a discourse in general. So historic narratives are necessarily looked at from the point of view of its potential propagation, whether it is religious, economic, political, it's all kind of interlinked and layered to that. So I think that is where when we look at a building like Hall of Nations, or we bring about the question of Hall of Nations, and when if you look at the process of what happened with Hall of Nations, a new, I think you pointed out, the new shiny vision of what can happen in that place, what can happen in Pragati Maidan. It's called Pragati Maidan, and Pragati means development. It was meant to showcase India's development in the 60s and the 70s, and that's why this place came up. But in order to showcase the image of development now, the demolition of that Pragati Maidan was, or the Hall of Nations and structures thereon was proposed, and the new shiny proposal came up at that time. So of course there were a lot of protests, and I think that was the first time that I saw that many architects mobilized and connected together to write letters, to build up the narratives of what that modern, the piece of modern architecture really meant. How was it, what did it do to the national identity for India? What does modernism mean, or what did modernism ever mean to India? So I think that was the first time that discussion went on. Now, there is a kind of a procedure that these structures or these decisions go through. So every city or most of the cities now have something called a Heritage Conservation Committee. So the Court of Law, when this kind of a PIL was filed by architects and engineers, the Court of Law directed the decision to the Heritage Conservation Committee. And the Heritage Conservation Committee kind of said that, well, the structure is not more than 60 years old. Now, where does that number 60 comes from is also another debate altogether. But it said it's not more than 60 years old, so it doesn't, we don't necessarily need to, it doesn't constitute as historic, or it does not constitute as a heritage listed building. And thus then the decision was given by the Heritage Conservation Committee to demolish it. And I think that was a major, I think that's a major wake up call for all of us. That in a way I feel that it is the way we have written histories as architects or as historians or as engineers, the way we have written the history of modern architecture in India. It has the histories and the narratives of modern architecture in India have always been apolitical. They are linked to an international movement. They are linked to a certain kind of understanding of modernity, of rational thinking. In India and in South Asia, these were also symbols of nation building after, in the post-colonial and post-independence narrative. I don't think we have yet, and I'm not saying that's, I'm not saying that to blame anybody, but I think it's high time we start looking at these as as piece of architectures that built a national identity, because the political narrative in India, and I don't claim to know much about Bangladesh, but the political narrative of India is clearly rejecting that part of Indian identity or national identity that was built during 60s and 70s. There's a rejection towards it. And these structures are a symbol of that, that time. So I feel that we need to recognize them for what it did to the country in terms of technology, in terms of national identity, beyond what its relationship to the politics of the time. And I think that's the direction we really need to go into. I hope I've answered your question here.
No, wonderful. I have to get back to you again on something that you said about particularly funding in historic preservation. You were rather optimistic about the investment in historic preservation. I think that's a fascinating topic. I will come back to you with, I want to ask you a little bit about that. But let me go to Wahida. So Wahida, you have, you have been working for the California Department of Transportation for a while, where you experienced the development and growth and the process of assessing the environmental impact of development. I think that's a fascinating topic, and there's so much to learn from that kind of conversation. So I was wondering if you could kind of shed some light on your, or tell us a little bit about your experience, and tell us about the process, if you could, the specifics of the process of analyzing or environmental impact of building and how it relates to historic preservation.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me. Those of you, this is for the listeners. Adnan and I went to the same school in Bangladesh, Buet, and I'm very happy to be here today. This is probably your third seminar that you're hosting, and I've listened to the past two, and this is a wonderful conversation around historic preservation and raising awareness among all of us, and to everybody who's listening. and hopefully the listeners can spread it around their circle of whoever they're associated with. So in terms of impact assessment, as you've seen my title here, I'm not in academics. I actually work for the government. So I'm probably wearing a very unique hat among the other panelists that you had previously. I did graduate as an architect. However, I've been working for the last 20 years in Northern California in Department of Transportation, preparing and authoring this impact assessment document. So a lot of people ask me, what is environmental planning? So as many of us probably know, we have many environmental resources that through our work, we probably try to, first of all, avoid them. And if we can't, we probably minimize the impact to them. And then if we can't do that, then we propose mitigation. So as an environmental planner, what I do is plan a public project around these environmental resources so they have the least impact on these environmental resources. So one thing to notice about when we say environmental resources, what are they? Typically it's air, noise, hazardous waste, biological resources, air, water, endangered species, any kind of plants and rivers, and there's just forests. But one of the unique resources is cultural heritage or cultural resources, which is our focus today. So cultural resources, as you know, and the one I want to draw your attention, all of our attention to the word resources. So why is that we call them resources? This is a fundamental thing. I hope all of us can understand resources, or in Bangla, we would call them shompod, right? So why are they called a shompod? So this is where the two other seminars you had panelists who are historians, you had panelists who are educators, journalists, socialists, economists, and all of them have acknowledged the fact that that culture and heritage is how important it is to preserve them, because they are resources to us. So another important aspect of cultural resource is it is a non-renewable resource, right? So if a project proposes to take 500 trees out or remove them, or fill a wetland with the fill material to build a construction or build a building, we can probably plant more trees, although that is not the ideal situation, but we could probably plant more trees. But if we take or demolish a historic property, that is a non-renewable resource. I think that's a very key understanding that we need to have. If we demolish Kamlapur rail station today, we can't just build a replica and have the same sentiment or heritage or culture that we would be representing now. We can just build another station and say it has the same value. So in America, in Northern California, the way we preserve cultural resources, because luckily we have in the first world, we have some laws that helps us protect them. So one of the major laws we have is Section 106 of National Historic Preservation Act. So that helps us to identify resources, find out if that resource has some historic merit, identify basically the level of significance if we were to propose to destroy that or demolish that. So these laws are very extensive. And so in the environmental document or as an environmental planner, what I do is to evaluate the level of significance of a historic resource. So in that same law, 106, what we have identified is not just architectural history as being cultural resources. However, we also protect parks, buildings, archaeological sites, battlegrounds, monuments, trails, shores, and historic and prehistoric many, actually, what I mean to say is the law is pretty expansive in terms of including many elements and not just building architecture. Currently, I'm dealing with a project where we are fighting to preserve historic trees. Historic preservation, like you said, Adnan Bhai, it's really an awareness, but within the impact assessment process, and with the help of law, it's helping to preserve these resources. I wanted to show you, I don't have a slideshow, but these are typically called the impact assessment reports. These are very thick. Last time I went to Bangladesh, I told my friends that this is what I do. And they said in Bangla, "Ogula keu pore na." So I said, meaning nobody reads them. This is just a big stack of papers that you can almost buy, or like looked at the impact assessment reports as a bunch of paperwork for government projects that are at just a protocol or like a process-oriented paperwork, a bureaucracy. But to me, it's really one of those tools which is very effective to call out, actually basically to call out government proposed projects and challenge their accountability. How are they actually, what are they proposing in the project? What is the context of proposing to demolish Kamlapur rail station? Why are they doing it? If they're doing it, what are their alternatives, choices that they had? So all of these discussions go in this 500, 600 pages EIA reports or impact assessment reports. I can go on forever, Adnan Bhai, so I will stop right there, and hopefully during Q&A or we can come back to it.
No, this is great, Wahida, and I was particularly struck by your emphasis on resources. Resources can be a very sort of embracive, inclusive concept to not only building, not only include buildings, but also historic trees or a shoreline or a waterfront, and this is great. And you also mentioned National Historic Preservation Act, which was, by the way, as you know, was created in the wake of the demolition of the Penn Station in New York in the 1960s. So
1966, yes, to be precise.
Correct, 1966. And while the Penn Station was being demolished from 63 to 66. So this is great, and I will come back to you with one more question. So thank you for that. Let me go back to Kate. Kate, if you, I know that your mother was an ardent lover of Bangladeshi culture, music, Jarigan, and many other. She preserved many other artifacts. I met her in the 1990s. I met her recently at your house. She's a wonderful person, a wonderful human being, a true connoisseur of culture. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your mother's experience in Bangladesh, and through her eyes, tell us a little bit about what we celebrate in Bangladesh. Give us your insight into Bangladeshi cultural heritage, including architecture. Look at Bangladesh through your mother's eyes and give us a more intimate human portrait.
Oh, I wish she was here to tell you directly herself. I can't do justice to how much she's done, her love of Bengal culture. I'll go back to sharing my screen so people can see what she looks like, and I can talk a little bit about what she's done. While my father was working 14-hour days, within her first week of moving to Dhaka in 1960, she said, I want to learn the language, and hired a teacher to come to her every day and start teaching her. But she also talked to all the staff of the hotel, the Shahbag Hotel, to teach her. Everyone she met, she was getting Bengali lessons, so that she started learning to converse quite quickly, which then gave her opened a door to so much of the culture and the literature of the country right away. And she was reading poetry within the first year, but she was also exploring Dhaka and wanting to help foreigners begin to appreciate Dhaka and what was in Dhaka, and not have the immediate reaction of, oh, the streets are dirty or there's a lot of poverty, because there was so much more. So she and some of her closest friends created really what was the first guidebook of Dhaka for foreigners in English. And my father did all the sketches, drawings in the book. So it was a partnership between them as well. And the book, it was so popular, it went through 5 editions, I think. And someone in the chat said that they have a copy of that book, which is wonderful to know. So my mother's, one thing was the city itself. She was fascinated by what was going on in the city and shared that through the guidebook. And she was fascinated by the language, to the point that she became a teacher of Bengali and taught the cholera doctors Bengali. And I show a picture here of these flashcards she created called Balo cards. And then the big scholarly work was she worked with Jasimuddin to help transcribe Jarigan music. And Jasimuddin discovered my mother because he found out that she had a harpsichord and knew how to transcribe music, and started visiting her quite often, and finally asked her, would she take on this project with him? And she became so engaged in the project that when we moved back to New York, she went to Columbia and got a degree in ethnomusicology, and then came back to Dhaka in the 1990s when I was doing Fulbright research in Dhaka. She was asked to update the research and turn it into a published book, which is this book now out called Jarigan. And in the midst of all that, she also worked with Sofa, translating his work into English. And I just found out this month that her translations will be published soon. So I'm not sure how that relates to the issue of preservation of architecture, but my parents were a team. And I think they had different interests and passions, but they fed each other. And even when we moved back to New York City, we brought a Bengali family back with us, who's part of my family. So being a foreign architect in Bangladesh, they weren't so foreign. Being foreign gave them a special perspective, I think, on what was wonderful about Bangladesh, so that when they did their own work, they could kind of spread that passion. Does that help? But like I said, it's really too bad she can't talk about this herself. And
No, it's good. You know, the reason I asked this question is, you know, how do we look at culture? You know what Wahida said, resources. How do we look at resources? How do we, you know, people look at resources with curiosity, with exploration, with many other thoughts. So when today we are facing these the risk of demolition of some mid 20th century buildings, we are wondering, people saw the value of these structures. A lot of thought went into the creation of these architectural icons. If the world can see the value in these icons, why can't our urban administrators, why can't our government officials see the same value? Why is not a robust public debate? So I think what you are talking about, your experience, all of these should help people see the value in these resources. So I think it's these personal memories are important to create a robust culture of awareness of historic preservation. So I always think that, you know, I'm sure many would agree that personal memories, personal activism to preserve. In your mother's case, she worked so hard to make Jarigan an important preservation of Jarigan as an important cultural artifact or resource. So I think it's very important. So let's go back to, can you unshare, Shafai? Okay. So thank you, Kate, for your insights, but I'm sure during Q&A we'll come back to it. So Niklaus, I want to come back to you, and if you could share some experience from Switzerland. You know, after all, you know, many of the, I'm sure you follow the many contentious debates about historic preservation in Europe. Corbusier was born in Switzerland, and you know, many of his works around the world sometimes face all kinds of contentious debates, their values and so on. So if you could share some insights from Switzerland or other parts of the world, and then bring that experience to Bangladesh, to, you know, how we can bolster, how we can kind of reinforce, reinvigorate a culture of preservation in Bangladesh, in other parts of the world. As you very rightly said, that this is not a local problem. This is a global problem. It is a problem in Latin America. It is a problem in Africa. It is a problem in America. You know, I see that as a problem in Washington, D.C. And so can you bring this global narrative in the context of Bangladesh, for particularly because you have created this, you know, exhibition, Bengal Stream?
Okay, I'll try to give an answer to that, but maybe it's again more a general view on what could be preservation of a modern monument, or why should a modern building be preserved at all. And of course, as you mentioned, it's a problem everywhere, also in Switzerland. It's not a long time ago since we have demolished a lot of modern buildings, late modern buildings, and still today we are constantly confronted with such issues that, of course, development is going on, and all the buildings are demolished every year. We cannot avoid it, and so it's a constant struggle. As I mentioned before, it's not something which is established and which is given for granted. But to come back to the question, why should we keep an old building? We were talking now quite a lot about culture, identity, history. But I think today, if we are looking for reasons for preservation of a building, we should also look again into that topic of the resources. I think this is a very crucial point which Wahida brought in. And also another thing which is important that Inga brought in about age of a building. I think, first of all, it has nothing to do with the age of a building, whether it is important to keep it or not. It is about the idea behind the building. It can be 3 years old and it should be kept forever. But it could be 200 years old and we can demolish it. I think there the thinking has to come away from this purely historical thinking. And this is maybe an approach which is wider understandable. Because it was mentioned before, some people say it's old, we can demolish. But I think it's not about old and new. It's about much more fundamental things. Why do we appreciate good food, which a recipe may be 100 years old, we still appreciate. We don't say it's not contemporary anymore. There are many examples of things we are doing for ages and generations, and they're still valuable today. So even a brand new idea like, let's say, the roof of Kamalpur station in the 60s is absolutely valuable to be kept, because it's the idea behind it which is of importance, not the age. That's maybe one thing which I'm observing also now here in Switzerland, that we are not only looking for or to keep the old buildings, but also some new ones. We have some buildings now built in the 1990s, and they're already in a register and they're already under protection. I'll give you an example. There is that bath by Peter Zumthor, the thermal bath in the mountains, which is not very old, but it's already in a monuments list. So there should not be that distinguishing between old and new. That's one thing. And then coming back to resources. Yes, resources are there in history, and our roots are resources, but also in terms of construction and material. We should be aware that waste of resource does not make any sense anymore. And if a building, for example, is not lasting for 100 years, it's a total waste of energy, of also human resources. This is more or less proved. So it doesn't make sense to demolish a building too early. Kamalpur station is 52 years old, 53 years old now. It's much too early to demolish it. It doesn't make sense also in terms of constructive knowledge, not only in terms of historical knowledge. And this is something I'm also observing when I'm seeing what the committees are following right now here in Switzerland, or also ETH has established a chair for constructive memories, constructive heritage. And this is all about resources, energy, technology. It's not only about historical value in terms of cultural value or let's say aesthetic values. And this is, I think, quite interesting because then we can look into different things. Infrastructure building can also be a part of that. It's not only about churches and temples and so-called monuments. I think preservation should look into many more directions. Wahida has mentioned forests, shorelines, absolutely. And if we are looking at the station or the students' teacher center, which is kind of a pragmatic building, nothing to do with an old temple, let's say. This is an important thing to look at in terms of is it valuable to protect it or not. And the other thing I think which is very important, a monument is not untouchable. I think we should come away from the idea that a monument is a monument and it has to remain like it is forever. And we have to restore it or to rebuild it, to do a replica. I think this is not contemporary thinking anymore. I think a monument is something very normal, very natural. We can touch it, we can reuse it, we can rebuild it, we can reprogram it. And especially if I'm looking now again at Kamalpur station, the concept of the huge, large canopy being like a forest with the little pavilions underneath, which can be removed, which can be rearranged, or even give it a new function. There are plenty of examples, and there maybe I can relate to the question, Adnan, about examples. Maybe not too many right now in Switzerland, but if we are looking to other countries like South America, Sao Paulo, there is that old station, Station Luz, which was transformed into a museum by Mendes da Rocha. We have stations in Paris, which were transformed into museums. We have factory buildings, which are now schools. And I think the lesson we can learn from all this is the reuse and reprogramming. We have to give a second life to the buildings. We cannot say it has a lifespan of these and such years, but it can have a second life. Maybe not as a station, maybe as something else. Right. And I think that's maybe a shift of paradigm when it comes to preservation. So maybe a monument is not what we should keep. Maybe sometime we can erase a so-called monument, but we should take into account that there are maybe hidden things, everyday buildings, which are much more important to be protected. For example, if it comes to public transport, there is the only icon I can think on public transport in Dhaka is Kamalpur station. Now Dhaka is establishing a new transportation system with the elevated rails, which is fantastic and absolutely necessary. And somehow it sounds really absurd that now a building which is the symbol of public transport should be demolished because of public transport. This is cannibalization, let's say. Yes. So I think these two can be brought together. And when I'm saying things cannot be untouched, why not combining those two? Why having hierarchies next to it? Why not having combine all the new? We should not be afraid.
Yeah. So no, that's excellent, Niklaus. I like the idea of one transportation, so-called modern transportation network cannibalizing an older transportation network. So I think that's a fascinating irony, and we should talk about it. I also appreciated your suggestion about adaptive reuse, that a building may be a little, lost its original purpose, but it can be co-opted into a new use, as you have given examples. And one example that I always think about is Tate Modern in England. Tate Modern is a wonderful, example of adaptive reuse, and also the African Museum of Modern Art in Cape Town, which was a grain silo converted into a beautiful museum by the London firm of Heatherwick. So these are great examples. So so let me go back to Jigna. Jigna, I wanted to ask you. You gave a very interesting insight during your first presentation about funding. So you said with a kind of an optimistic tone that a lot of funding is being invested in historic preservation. So tell us a little bit more about that. Is it from public sector or private sector or both? And how is it being used? Is it being used in the restoration of historic buildings itself, or in the process, or in education, or in awareness building? So that's one question I want you to ask. And the other part is, you talked about the nature of history that you're looking at. The kind of history is, of course, not a given, right? In the past is not given. It's interpreted by the people now. So you said that it's always tied to larger religious, religious socio-cultural narratives. So which makes it contentious, of course. If you look at the past from a particular religious standpoint, it's always problematic. It kind of not inclusive. So if you could, after the funding question, if you could reflect on a little bit on, so for example, the Central Vista project, which will transform Edwin Lutyens' core of New Delhi. And what is the controversy now? How it's being kind of narrated within the official lens of Modi government. If you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think and if you don't mind, I'll also want to add a little bit about that question or the discussion that Katherine brought out about the importance of personal memories. And I think from that point of view, I'll also bring in the IIMA dormitory case, if you don't mind, as once again to end on a slightly optimistic note once again. So to bring in the question of funding, it is coming from public sectors as well as private sectors. So there is government funding through the ministries, through schemes. So there are specific schemes that are being outlined for, let's say, heritage cities or historic cities. But as I said, they're being identified as the cities that are being identified or sites that are being identified are the sites that have this religious lens to it. And as you rightly pointed out, it's a problematic position to take. I think it is in, and when you ask the question about which sectors is this funding going in, part of it is going into conservation. A lot of it is going into developing infrastructure and especially tourism infrastructure around these historic sites. So once again, there is a kind of push towards modernizing these places for tourist consumption. So there is a kind of, as I said, there's an economic consumption point of view to it as well. The funds that go into, and because there is a kind of a imbalance of funds that go to preservation versus the fund that go towards infrastructure development, the infrastructure development is not always and not necessarily sensitive to the historic sites. So there is a kind of inherent kind of a conflict there as well. And I think what Wahida brought out in terms of impact assessment is something that I keep on kind of talking about, that's a very important tool. We have that tool in our governance and administrative systems. It's embedded in our processes, but it does not always get kind of mobilized, or it does not always get used in the way it should be used, especially in these kind of situations. And I think that from there, I'll come to the question of Central Vista or the Central Vista project. At all points when I have spoken about the Central Vista project, I have always kind of said that a public project like this must undergo an impact assessment process, whether it is the questions that are being raised on the Central Vista project are about the environmental impact it is likely to have, the impact it is likely to have on the historic trees that were planted in a particular way in order to create a certain kind, create the Janpat or the Vista. There should be a heritage impact assessment or done as well, which is a tool that we have in our country. So that has been my stand. And these are the kind of discussions that are going around. I think needless to say, the project is a political ambition. It's an ambitious project of a political motivation. It is also being kind of projected as ambition of the nation, that as a nation we need to kind of have a capital that rivals Washington DC, and it has been said by in public forums as well. So I'm quoting things that have already been said, so it's not my imagination here. But yeah, it is said that it has to be it's nation's ambition. And I think that is where, once again, I think it's interesting to link the idea of historic preservation, what gets called as, or what gets designated to be historic and what gets designated to be a cultural resource. I think in India and possibly in South Asia, I think also, I mean, mostly in South Asia, one of the reasons why we are struggling with the colonial heritage and historic sites, as well as the modern historic buildings, is because we are not yet discussing them, or we don't have enough articulated narrative to discuss them as historic. I don't think we've established these sites as historic sites yet in a formal framework. In the realm of architectural discourses, we all inherently understand them as historic, because I think, as Niklaus was pointing out, that these are important ideas, these are important technological introductions, these are important introductions in terms of ideologies and what in terms of what they do to energy and what they do to climate and all of that. So in the architectural discourse or historical discourse, we understand that as historic, but in the official discourse of governance, they are not established as historic yet. And I think that is the discourse that we need to bring out in order to establish them as historic sites. And that's where I think I'll link to that idea of personal narratives and personal stories. I think the hopeful example here is of the IIMA dormitories, where there was a expression of interest that was brought out by the IIMA administration that implied that the dormitories may be demolished. And of course, all the architects came together. It's a major Louis Kahn project. All the architects from all over the world came together and presented it as a very personal narrative of what Louis Kahn's architecture does to us as architects, and why it is important to us as architects, and how it defines our identity. And I think it's that narrative that kind of pushed towards thinking of IIMA's architecture as historic architecture. I'm not saying that the discussion is over yet, but I think it was that personal engagement that brought out this this narrative in a very strong way. And I think that's an important direction to take.
No, Jigna, I think you are absolutely right about the pressure that was put on the IIM administration to stop demolition or rescind this decision to demolish the 14 dormitories. So personal memories. In fact, so many people wrote to D'Souza, the director of IIM. So many people, so many organizations from around the world flooded his office with letters from around the world. So I think it matters. It matters. International pressure matters. International outrage matters. And personal memories the value of personal memories cannot be overemphasized. They are of utmost significance. So I personally think that the more we talk about these icons, resources, as Wahida said, and Niklaus said, these resources have to be constantly on the public forum. We have to have a robust debate around these objects and icons, and they can be a historic tree, they can be a shore, they can be an infrastructure, and so on. But the more personal engagement, the more personal reflections on these projects, trees and shores, the better. Then the significance of these resources sink in. only when there is a robust public debate can there be laws, can there be government initiatives, funding to protect these buildings. So I want to come back to Wahida for my last question, and then we'll go on to Q&A. Wahida, you brought in a very important question of resources. I am fascinated by the idea of resources, that it can be so many different things. And you also emphasize the significance of laws. You said laws help, laws aid the preservation process. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how laws can be a experience, or how the experience of the impact of laws that protect heritage resources, how can we take these experiences to Bangladesh? What kind of knowledge sharing platforms can you imagine or can you recommend that you know, not only from California, but from other parts of the world? How can we create a knowledge sharing platforms where the specificities of laws, the knowledge of them can be shared? If you have any insights about that.
Absolutely. Great question, Adnan Bhai. So I mentioned 106 in a previous discussion. And as I was listening to Niklaus and Jigna, and so there's around historic preservation, or there's a lot of human sentiment, right? There's a lot of human emotions. So one of the beauty of 106, the way it's laid out, is if we are to impact a historic resource, the ownership of these cultural resources are actually on the people. So it's like the way it's written is, if, for example, if Komlapur rail station is impacted, then by law and by the assessment of this impact assessment report, we meaning, now I'm saying, if I were to author this impact assessment, I have to find a way to build a consensus among the people to find a solution for this proposal. So for example, I'm working on a historic wall right now in the impact assessment report that I'm producing. So the project proposes to demolish a historic wall, a much minor issue than a Komlapur rail station. So the historic wall is demolished, going to be demolished, and now we want some sort of mitigation for that. So what 106 is, the law is pushing us, is to communicate with the stakeholders. So who are these stakeholders? So the stakeholders are the important organization, the users, and anybody who has interest in preserving preserving historic resources. So for example, you and I can form a nonprofit organization that cares about historic resources. So in Bangladesh, anybody, architects, socialists, economists, anybody who cares about historic resources, they can form a nonprofit organization. For other resources I mentioned, for example, I said trees and rivers and wetlands. So as you may have heard, we have organizations like US Fish and Wildlife, who we have to coordinate with a loss of an endangered species, or Army Corps of Engineers for impacting waters of the US or wetlands. But for historic resources, we have to coordinate with SHPO, which is called State Historic Preservation Officer, that's the state side, and the federal side is under the law of 106. It's actually under the Department of Interiors. But this law pushes us like, okay, you're proposing to demolish this wall. Guess what you have to do? Go back to your community. You have to coordinate with your community, the people, and those nonprofit organizations who care about preserving this wall. So it's all on us meaning people now. So it pushes us to do that. So in Bangladesh, for example, I was talking about trees earlier. What do you think the Ramna Park, the Ramnar Bottomol, the huge oak tree that we have, or the bodgach that we have, imagine the historic value that tree has. And those of you who haven't been to Bangladesh, it's a beautiful, huge banyan tree that under that we have cultural programs around the Noboborsho, or the Bengali New Year celebration for ages now. So that tree has so much historic value, but I don't know if that has been identified as a historic resource. So my point is, people have to engage and take interest in these preservations. And for that, we need the awareness, and that's exactly what we're trying to do here. American laws, or the cultural resource laws we have, allows that kind of an engagement of people. It's almost like the law pushes you to engage with people and find out what the people want, because it's ultimately us who is having to live with our environment. We care about this tree, we care about this building, we care about this monument that I see every day going to the cafe that I go to. So the law is written in a way that it encompasses or pushes us to do that. So in Bangladesh, I don't see why that can't be done. In Bangladesh, the laws are already there. I have actually written a paper for Ben, as Adnan Bhai, you have mentioned, on the Rampal power plant project, looking at a critical review on the EIA that was prepared for that project. From the perspective of preservation of the Sundarban forests, right? In this case, it was a forest. So my advice would be, the law should be written in a way so it's inclusive of many things other than buildings. And the second issue is its engagement with public and people and foundations or nonprofit organizations that are interested in it. And the law should be written in a way that it has to engage the public and the people who care about these built environments and want to preserve it, whether it's a railway station or a TSC or any other building, and that, anything that the government proposes to demolish for some other proposed project in the name of development. So that's how I look at it. So the public engagement is a huge, huge component to it. And I want to actually empower public or nonprofit organizations, and anybody can go in and take interest in this, and the law has to respect that, honor that,
That's great. Exactly what I wanted our audience to hear, that we have to recraft the law in a way that empowers the people. Then another question is, in order to empower the people, or in order to make people aware of the significance of resources, we have to propagate, we have to campaign about these resources, right? We have to tell people, the people who can, they have to tell people. That's why the significance of Bengal Stream, that's why the significance of other exhibitions, that's why the significance of personal memories, that's why the significance of simply writing an article or an op-ed or a book. so that people became aware of it. So I remember once I wrote an op-ed about the significance of TSC in Dhaka. A very good friend of mine, a senior colleague of mine who was an alumnus of Dhaka University, he told me that I did not know that TSC, where I spent so much time, it is designed by a Greek planner, Greek architect. I did not know that. I did not know the significance of TSC. So I think if we can, we have to spread the knowledge. There is no alternative to spreading knowledge about the significance of this. We cannot assume that people just know the significance of the Brahma Bottomul, the banyan tree that Wahida you are talking about. We cannot assume that people who would be familiar with the significance of the central vista, right, Jigna? We, Edwin Lutyens, this central axis that leads to the governor's house or presidential palace now, we cannot assume that people know all these. So I think the more we spread the knowledge, the better. We ran out of time.
Adnan.
Yes, please.
Adnan.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting.
No,
I think
ahead,
this is a very crucial point that Wahida brought in. People's knowledge, and you're absolutely right. The news must be spread, but on the other hand, I'm totally convinced that the news is already there, but nobody has asked the people. Because especially in Bangladesh, I experienced something I've never experienced before. When I came to Dhaka the first time, almost 10 years back, some people asked me, why are you here? And I admit my reason was to see Louis Kahn's building. So people in the street at a tea stall, they asked me, why are you here? I said, because of, there is a famous architect, a famous building here. Immediately they said, Louis Kahn. Imagine this would happen in Switzerland or in Paris, forget it. Nobody would mention the name of a famous architect. Kamalapur station, they may not tell you who is the architect, but they all know the building. And nobody has asked all these people yet. They are going through there. I think the knowledge is there, and we're talking about trees. I think Kamalapur is the biggest Gotchtola in town. And people feel it. They feel this is a special place. You don't need to put the sign there. I think you just need to ask people what they think about it. And the knowledge is already there, conscious or unconscious. I'm quite sure. And this is what I experienced.
No, that's it. Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. I think you're absolutely right that knowledge may be there, but we have to now consolidate the people's power. People, bring together people to spread the awareness so that government administrators cannot say that we will move Kamalapur railway station 300 meters away.
That's my point. Yes, yes. I think the knowledge is there, but nobody dares to ask for it. And people who are sorry, Kate.
Well, I wanted to just add another tool that governments have that we haven't talked about that's very important. And I used to work for city planning in New York. It's very hard for the city to regulate all preservation. And sometimes when they do, it's too regulated. So another direction is to incentivize it. And in New York, ever since Penn Station, we have what's called transfer of air rights, development rights, which has worked very well, where a developer buys the air rights over a historic valued building to build something taller somewhere else, usually adjacent. But it's a very good tool that saves a building forever, because those rights for a bigger development are gone once they're sold. And it's something that I think a city like Dhaka could use to preserve a lot of the monuments when that kind of economic incentive is put with it without having to regulate too much.
So no, thank you, Kate. I think transfer of development right is being talked about a great deal these days. I was listening to somebody, Taimur, who is very active in the preservation of old Dhaka. You know, in a presentation, he was talking about this a very valuable tool, transfer of development right, to preserve some of these low-rise, 200-year-old houses in old Dhaka. So I think it's being used. So I think one of the most important thing is to cultivate the knowledge that exists, broaden the scope of laws. Yeah, as Wahida said and Jigna said too, laws are there. There are organizations like Heritage Conservation Committee in India. These are powerful, very valuable organizations, government agencies. But maybe it's time also to look at laws themselves. In the case of Bangladesh, that how can we make them more expansive, and how can we give a legal definition to heritage, to resources. The other day in our second conversation, attorney Rizwana Hassan laid it out that we have some laws enshrined in the Constitution. The heritage, we cannot destroy heritage. This is in the Constitution. But oftentimes the interpretation of that clause is vague. And then it's kind of interpreted the way you deem fit, and then to serve your individual interests or some particular government interests. So I think the time has come to re-strengthen, to broaden the laws and give more articulated definition of resources. And one thing that Wahida mentioned, non-renewable resources. I think that's a fascinating concept, that if you demolish Kamalapur, or if you demolish a very important building in Ahmedabad, a historic building, it's not coming back. It's never coming back. You can never restore the dignity, humanity, and the memories of that building if you demolish and recreate the exact, replica. You can exactly recreate the Taj Mahal in Tamil Nadu, but it will never be the Taj Mahal. You can create Penn Station in California, but it will never be the Penn Station that we know, right? So I think it's a good time to take a look at our questions. So I'm going to go to Q&A and ask you the questions, if you give me just a second. So there are many questions. The first question is from Waziuddin Chowdhury, Wahida's neighbor, perhaps, Saud Bhai. So this is a comment. This is a comment rather than a question. I urge plaudits to Adnan and the panelists to have put together this program. I ardently hope that this is being seen and or will be shared with people that can make consequential decisions. So that's good. So, and he asked a question to Kate. So he says, it's a long comment perhaps. I have a hard copy of your mother's book that was gifted to my father by your father. Interesting book, mainly directed to expatriates from the West that needed some guidance in how to live in Dhaka in the 60s. My question really is that with huge development underway in countries in South Asia, where there is a huge pressure to demolish and rebuild larger and denser developments, should not be there be some rules set up to establish what constitutes landmark to be preserved, as there are in the West, and albeit written around the South Asia's matrix. As Jigna Desai mentioned, the heritage buildings as understood are ones that evoke interest of archaeologists, the ones written about by Dr. Nazimuddin Ahmed. buildings of architectural significance is not understood by members of general public, and architects have to work ahead in making the public aware of these. So I think all of you have suggested some steps that how do you make people aware? So how do you make people aware of the cultural artifacts? I think you have one way or the other, you have responded to the question. Does anybody have a very quick response to this?
I think the idea of recycling the building, giving it a use that's current, that a general public, is an immediate way to bring awareness that this building now has a new life and an appreciation that it had a former life.
Okay.
And there were so many precedents of stations that have turned into museums, libraries, things.
Okay. Yeah. Kate, I hope I didn't interrupt you. Were you done, or that's it? Yeah, okay. So the next question is to Wahida. There are different impact assessment methods. To you, what will be the proper method to follow in times of impact assessment for heritage buildings in Bangladesh? So impact assessment in the particular metrics of Bangladesh. Wahida.
So I've researched a little bit on the environmental laws that are in place in Bangladesh right now, as I was writing this paper on the Rampal power station in Sundarban. So there are laws written, and yes, there are different levels of impact assessment you can write. It all depends on the complexity of the environmental impact. In this case, the Kamlapur rail station, it is actually it's a ridiculous proposal. I have to say that out. I want to throw it out there. So it's definitely the highest level of impact assessment, which is called an EIR, is Environmental Impact Report, which is the highest level of, because it's a significant impact to the historical resource. So it would not be the lower level of the environmental impact assessment. It would be the highest one, if that's the answer.
Okay. Okay. Next question is, I think we have responded to all four of you kind of in one way or the other responded to this question. Does Bangladesh have laws to preserve cultural resources, and could existing laws be used for preserving them? I would rather, we have laws in Bangladesh that their implementation is problematic, I think. And also, to my question about awareness of heritage or resources among the legal community in Bangladesh, Rizwana Hassan said it flat out that no, that awareness of heritage preservation, resource preservation among the legal community is not there in a strong sense. So I think laws are there, but I think it's time to go back to them, reassess the law's impact, and perhaps amend some laws to reinforce their impactffulness is the main cause. There's
if I could interject real quick on that note, regarding laws. So in America, the environmental laws that are written, they are constantly being amended, as you just mentioned. So how do they get amended? Court cases. So I really, again, want to empower people, and it can be any third party. Take these environmental documents and proposals with the proper knowledge in the law and show and challenge that this law was broken. And that's the only way things will improve. We can go back to writing or amending laws, but till people actually take them to court, things will not change. And it's the same thing in America.
Thank you. Jigna, Jigna, would you like to respond as well? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just going to add to that, there are, and I have done my studies in Ahmedabad, the historic city of Ahmedabad, which is a World Heritage Site. Many such situations of damage to historic sites or even damage to certain cultural practices were averted due to public interest litigations. I think even the Central Vista project at present has multiple public interest litigations against it. And I think it is through these processes, of course, it takes time. It's not going to be, because even the lawyers need to be more aware, and the judges need to be more aware, and the committees need to be more aware. But I think it is through these processes that one can actually push the laws to amend, to kind of reassess, and to push towards preserving the cultural resources.
Oh, this is fascinating. Thank you. Thank you for that insight. So next question is the previous question was from Ahmed Badruzzaman, also California, and Badruzzaman Bhai. Thank you for that question. The next question is from AJ Huda. Preserving a historic sentimental emotion, the invisible driving force like a glue, gluing together every changing realities, communities attached with different identities, intentioned in the social drama, becoming more and more a dry, systematic, made-up lifestyle societies. I'm not sure. Does anybody can make sense of that question? So I think what brings us together, the invisible driving force that acts like a glue, different realities. Can anybody make sense of that question? Or Nicholas, I think you are probably Nicholas, do you want to respond, or we can move on to the next question?
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to decode, actually, the question, but maybe what I could pick up here is that the mentioning different identities, which I think is interesting.
Which you have mentioned already.
Yes.
Which you have. Actually, next question is to you too. You invite your friends and foreigners to explore Bangladesh. Do you have any plan to promote heritage tourism of Bangladesh to your friends and foreigners? One question. How do you promote storytelling of heritage buildings in Switzerland? So good question. Two questions. Do you have any plans? I hope you do, to promote Bangladesh's tourism, resources. And then, how do you do storytelling of heritage buildings in Switzerland?
To the first question, yes, it already happens. We have established a joint venture in Dhaka, which is called Architecture Bangladesh, and I'm running this project together with a friend, Jewel, in Dhaka, who is entrepreneur of Royal Bengal Tours, and together we are doing these trips with foreign architects from Europe, for example, for instance, bringing people to the architectural, but also to the historical sites. So these tours are not only on contemporary architecture, they're also about, let's say, the full span from Parapur to whatever it is. We're visiting all these historical sites, of course, and of course a lot of buildings in old Dhaka, and also the landscape, the Sunderbans. So this is an inclusive kind of approach to architecture. We do not only go and see the latest buildings of the architectural production of today, but we would like to see the whole context, and they're very important. We do a lot of visits these historical sites. And the second question about storytelling in Switzerland, I think it's not different from what you do in other places to tell a story about a historical monument. I think a good storytelling also refers to today. You know, we cannot only talk about old days. We should refer to today. What was the monument at the time, and what could be for us today? So we would like to take away the fear of, as I mentioned before, to touch a monument. It belongs to us also today. It's not something from old times. We can deal with it in the same way like generations before have used it. And this is, I think, very important. We should really not being too respectful, you know. Somebody used the term over-regulation before. I think, Kate, what you mentioned. I think this is a danger, you know, by establishing too many laws, too strict laws, it becomes fundamental. And then there is again a gap between the specialists, the lawmakers, the historians, and the people. And for example, also the investors. We should not be afraid to invite them to get together and have ideas. So the storytelling of a historic building should not be like the telling of the Bible or of a holy book. It should be something very, very common. And we should get everybody on board. Is it a child, but is it also an investor? It does not help to have too many regulations and too many laws, which then would again build up a confrontation between different parties. I think that's the point on storytelling.
There's another question which I also find very relevant to our conversation today, is that age of the building should not be the only criterion for its preservation. And just because a building is old does not mean that it's worthy of preservation. Or just because a building is 4 years old does not mean that it can be demolished, or it cannot be worthy of significance. So I want to go back to Jigna. If you could sort of briefly reflect on some of the you know, if there is any case that you are aware of in Ahmedabad where age versus its contemporaneous significance, if there was any debate, if you know of any case study that can be of significance for our conversation today.
So I think I've already spoken of the IIMA discussion, but let me take the example of our own university and the CEPT University. The building, the first building of Faculty of Architecture, which was School of Architecture in 60s, established a School of Architecture, was built by B.V. Doshi, who was now a Pritzker Prize winner. And it has in it all these embedded narratives of modernism in India, and he was one of the he worked with Corbusier, he worked with Kahn, and he interpreted the modernist ethos into the buildings he made. And our School of Architecture was one such building, and I remember that it went through, I think around 2012, and just around that time, it went through this major discussion around what happens to a building that is possibly it was going to be 50 years old. It does not live up to the requirements of educational spaces of today, and what happens to the campus that came around it. And I remember very heated debates around is age relevant to it being historic or not, or is its utility related directly to it being historic or not. And after many, we went through this very interesting phase of discussions and debate in order to identify exactly these kind of questions, that just because something is older than other, does it become more important? Just because something is newer than the other, does it become less important, or vice versa? Just because something is old, does it have to be preserved? And this entire discussion around what is the relevance of, what does the building mean?
For example, if we would look at the example in Dhaka, let us compare. I mean, comparing is always difficult, but let us take Curzon Hall and let us take Kamalapur Station. So in terms of construction, in terms of resources, in terms of technical knowledge or innovation, which one would be the one you have to preserve? If you look at the fake brick facade of Curzon Hall, which is done in plaster, and it's a building which you may have seen anywhere else before. And then you look at Kamalapur, you have never seen such structure in your lifetime before. So the question is, which one should be protected? I'm saying both of them, of course, but it's not a question that the older one is first and the newer one.
Yeah, I think it eventually boils down, and that's the discussion we need to have, that what does a building mean to us today in terms of what it represents, in terms of whether it's history, technology, meanings, and I think that's where the central debate should be.
Okay, all right. So we are at the end of our time. May I ask you to give an exactly 1 minute final statement, if you may have. Exactly 1 minute, 1 minute, kind of, your final thoughts. It doesn't have to be conclusive. Your final thoughts after our conversation, starting with Kate, 1 minute each.
I think the things that I'm happy to hear in this discussion is this value for the reuse of the building, not frozen in time as a train station. And knowing my father, he was a recycler by nature. There was not a broken umbrella he could pass without fixing it or turning it into something else. And so I think the hope for structures like Kamalapur Station is that creative, skilled designers look at the problem and see a way to achieve whatever the development goal was without demolishing the existing building. And I think in Dhaka, there's now this hope is here that there'll be some proposals, because it's a creative solution that's needed. And buildings like Kamalapur Station have a monumental scale that lend them to be a civic space. Like so many of these train stations that have been reused, it's kind of a category in itself, that it has this opportunity to be a place where the citizens of Dhaka can still enjoy that space, even if it becomes a shopping mall or the lobby to a hotel or whatever. But I think it's a design challenge that can also save these structures with.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Kate.
You.
Thank you. Niklaus, 1 minute.
All right, I'm fully agreeing with Kate. Thanks for this minute. So I'm adding the second part. I think the use of a building is the best way to protect it. A monument should be used, and we have to use it as an everyday object and not as something which is from another time and another planet. And as soon as a building is used, it is maintained naturally, and it is accepted, and nobody has the idea that it's obsolete. So I would claim for use the monuments, take them as they are, whatever age they have. I think they belong to all of us, and they most of all also belong to the people. I think people should have access to all these monuments. I'm also thinking about a fence around certain buildings. You know which one I mean.
Thank you, Niklaus. So Jigna, your 1 minute.
So I think I'm going to extend the argument once again, so I don't have to spend too much time on this. I think we also we are talking about reuse of buildings, and we also in our discussion talked about what they mean to us today. And I think it is important for us to then define what today means for us. Where are we in the history of the world? And today is the time when resources are scarce. We are dealing with climate change. We are dealing with issues of resources. And while there is a question of meaning that is associated to all these buildings, there's a question of resources, it as a cultural resource, the building as a cultural resource, but generally as a building that exists. And a building doesn't have to be demolished sometimes because it exists and it meaningfully exists there. I think we live in that time today, and I think we need to take that as a lesson as well.
Thank you, Jigna. And Wahida, your 1 minute.
All right. I want to say power to the people. I really want to empower my fellow architects that live in Bangladesh, not just architects, any discipline. Please look into EIA process. They have a whole public engagement process. Engage in them. Form these nonprofit organizations where you are interested to preserve the historic resources, and just engage and care about your environment, care about these buildings or trees or whatever you care, and engage. So my message is public engagement is very, very crucial there.
Yeah, thank you. Couldn't agree more. So let me just, summarize in a few minutes, summarize our takeaways from today. My one thing that I struck out for me was the funding. Government allocation of funding in government, public sector, private sector investment in the process of historic preservation. It is, we can just debate and argue that, okay, this building has to be preserved, but we need funding. We need investment in the process of funding. That's number one. Number two is that this is not a local problem. Historic preservation and the risk of buildings that face is not a local problem. It is a global problem, as Niklaus said. It is a global problem. So knowledge sharing, we have to know from each other. We have to reinforce, re-strengthen our collaborative space in which we can learn from each other. We can put pressure in situations where a building is demolished. So collaboration, the global nature of the problem, we have to understand. The third point is that kind of came from all of you, is the adaptive reuse of historic buildings. That a monument or a historic building does not have to be frozen in time. It does not have to be falsely antiquated in a past time. It can be dynamic. It can be in contemporary use. Think about Kamalapur or any other building. Kamalapur, let's say the building is not serving its current purposes of a train station. That's so probably an understandable situation, but it can be put to a new use. It can be a museum of transportation. It can be of many different uses. So adaptive reuses, all of you have re-emphasized. And another thing is the laws, which Wahida kind of very significantly emphasized. The laws should be there. Laws to protect these buildings and their application of laws. And laws have to be amended. Laws have to be revisited. And current litigations could be a kind of a catalyst for amending existing laws. We know that in America, in India, in Bangladesh, in other countries, there are laws, but those laws are vaguely interpreted and not applied with the full scope and force of the law. So we have to do that. Another takeaway from today's conversation is resources, the scope of resources, and broadening the definition of resources. It's not only buildings. It can be a tree. I know that in Bangladesh, in fact, in front of TSC, there were some historic trees. All of them are cut. There are trees being cut. There are riverfronts that are being occupied by land grabbers and depriving people access to water. So I think expanding the definition of resources is very important, and it's about time. And and also to spread the knowledge. Niklaus said knowledge is there, but we can reinforce the knowledge, reinforce better knowledge. I mean, knowledge pursuit is never stopped. Knowledge can be spread, and it can be a continuous dynamic process. And these are so I think these are some of the takeaways from today's conversation. But I see that there is a question that just came now, which I think we can conclude with that question today, that let's say we have been successful in preserving a building from demolition. Let's say we have been able to stop the demolition of Kamolapur. But let's not forget that Kamolapur is 53 years old. Some of its columns are a little, structural integrity-wise in a difficult situation. How do we create expertise to do the actual restoration properly and authentically, and without forgetting its original intent? Creating expertise in the actual process of restoration, the nitty-gritty, the technique of restoration, we also need to bring that into the forefront, perhaps make it part of an essential part of curriculum in schools. Not only awareness building, but to be able to do the actual restoration. I think that's very important. So I think these are some of the very important takeaways from our today's conversation. It's been 2 hours. Thank you for spending your 2 hours with us today. And on behalf and all the attendees who were able to listen to us, thank you. Thank you to Shafayat, who was an efficient tech support, who made this possible. I want to also thank BRAC University Administration for allowing us to use this professional version of Zoom, which is very expensive to so we are grateful for that. But most of all, I am very grateful to our attendees for listening in, and I'm very grateful to our panelists for spending their 2 valuable hours. And so thank you very much. Goodbye. Take care.
Thank you.
Stay well, stay safe.
Thank you, Adnan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.